Welcome to the Asking Why podcast. I'm your host, Clint Davis. I'm a marriage and family therapist and licensed professional counselor trained in trauma and addiction. The Asking Why podcast is for anyone on a journey of healing and restoration. If you are searching for answers to life's questions and want to learn more about root causes from a psychological and theological mix, this show is for you. In this podcast, myself and a co-host from Clint Davis Counseling and Integrative Wellness will interview guests on a wide range of topics in order to get down to the heart of the problems facing our world and understand why things happen and how to change the world and ourselves for the better. Want to learn more tips and tricks to living a healthy lifestyle? Visit us at Clint Davis Counseling and Integrative Wellness on Facebook and Instagram. If you want to meet our staff or book a speaker, go to clintdaviscounseling.com. Thanks for listening and be sure to subscribe today. All right, Asking Why podcast, episode 32. We got some debate about that before we started, but that's correct. So today I have Kelsey Petty. She's one of our therapists here. She's a licensed social worker, LMSW, correct? Yep. So we're excited to have you. And we're going to talk about anxiety. So for those of you listening, this is something we haven't covered in depth on the podcast, so we're going to do that today. But the reason is because I think over the last 10 years, we've seen a huge increase in anxiety disorders, just anxiety in our children, anxiety in general and across the culture. But especially since COVID, I think there was already a problem with anxiety that we were dealing with, and really just treating symptoms a lot, whether medication or breathing techniques or whatever. So today we're going to talk a little bit about root causes in children and adults, and then we're going to try to kind of talk about the pandemic a little bit and maybe how that fear is exacerbated what was laying dormant or already there, and then social media and blah, blah, blah. So we'll get into all of it. But anyway, welcome, Kelsey, to the podcast. So kind of intro who you are and what you do here for us and then in general.
Okay.
Yeah.
Kelsey Petty, LMSW, working towards my LCSW, licensed clinical social worker. I have been working for Clint Davis Counseling for 1 year tomorrow.
Yeah.
Isn't that crazy?
That's awesome.
Yes. And went and got my master's degree at Loyola University in Chicago. Born and raised in Chicagoland. Only moved here in the last year and a half. So yeah. Louisiana is new to me.
Dealing with all this southern charm.
Yes, and the southern heat this summer.
Well, it just got hot. I mean, we were talking about this yesterday, that June, this is the first time I think in my entire life of being in Louisiana, most of my life, that June was as soon as I've started complaining. It's typically way earlier. So
okay.
We've had a good summer. Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, I remember in Bossier, this was like 4 or 5 years ago, we had like 100 and something days of over 100 degrees. It was like a record. So
yeah.
Miserable. Chicago's not like that, though.
It's not like that at all, but we have cold winters, so it's a nice change of pace.
Oh yeah, we whine tremendously when it's like 15 degrees outside.
Yes.
I think it's the Arctic.
That's right. Yes. So when did I know I wanted to be a social worker? I would say I've always been pretty passionate about social justice, advocacy, speaking up for the oppressed. And so when I started university, what that meant to me was that I was going to go to law school someday. I always thought I'd be an attorney. I would advocate for people within the criminal justice system or the legal system. And I think as I immersed myself into that world, I quickly learned how complex those systems are and how slow they are to change.
Yeah.
And so my perspective shifted to working with families and individuals to see quicker change, I guess, or change not within a really complex system.
Mm-hmm.
So my heart for social justice really lined up with social work, and I got my master's in social work, and always knew through that program I wanted to work with kids. My specialization in grad school was to work in a school. So learning about working with kids in that system. And my mom is a social worker and works with people who've experienced domestic violence, and I've seen how fulfilling her career is to her as well. So I think that's what pushed me kind of into this field. Yeah.
And you're married and you have 2 little girls, right?
2 little girls, 3 and 18 months.
So you're in the midst of it.
In the midst of it, in the trenches.
Yeah.
Keeps me busy, but it's awesome. A lot of fun too.
So tell us a little bit about, one of the things we talked about before and have talked about is kind of our own, people ask all the time as counselors, do we struggle with things? Can you talk a little bit about kind of your story with anxiety anything like that?
Sure. I would probably categorize myself as an anxious kid who grew into an anxious adult, but was equipped really well with ways to manage that.
Okay.
I think we'll get in today a little bit about who is kind of predisposed to anxious thinking and anxious nervous systems and things like that. And so I think part of it is just who I am. And I've learned a lot of skills and coping skills and been through my own therapy enough to not let it be debilitating. But I do think it kind of becomes a little bit a part of your characteristics of what makes you you and what makes you tick. And so, yeah, I would say anxiety has been something that I've overcome throughout my life for sure.
Awesome. Well, tell us what anxiety is. So, we talk about it as clinicians all the time, but, what is anxiety?
To me, anxiety it's a human emotion. It is an alarm in our brain that alerts us to the potential risk or discomfort of a situation. It's the anticipation of something, and it's a level of uncertainty and the need for control. And so I think what the pandemic has done is it's exposed our addiction to predictability.
That's good.
And our desire to control outcomes and to be able to predict what's going to happen next. And I think the pandemic has unveiled that that's not reality. It's not real. Things have been like an illusion of control about what's going to happen next in your life. And so while I do think anxiety has been tied to the actual medical components of the pandemic, I think a lot of it is just about the fact we're not in control as much as we thought we were or as much as we'd prefer to be.
Yeah, that's good. Addiction to prediction.
Yes.
Yeah, that's good.
That's right. And just that our kids are going to go to school, for a certain amount of time, or that they're going to be able to do this or that, or that we can travel, and those things just, were taken out from underneath of us. So I think the Institute of Mental Health says that 1 in 5 adults have a diagnosed anxiety disorder, but that research was pre-pandemic. I think it would be probably even higher.
Well, I think some of the new polls are showing like a 19% increase in college freshmen with diagnosable anxiety.
Yes.
And then we know that, whether we do the research on it or not, if we have this 200% increase in self-harm for 13 to 14, or what is it? 13 to 18-year-old kids or whatever, it's like, well, that's anxiety. It's trying to use your body and self-harm to control, an anxiety that's underneath everything that then gets released when you hurt yourself. It's a crazy mix. But the reality is that we know that anxiety is at the root of that self-harm.
Right.
And so if that's increased, then anxiety has had to have increased.
Yep.
But again, I think part of the problem is people don't know what anxiety is or what the details of it are. And so, if you give somebody a checklist and say, are you anxious? If it's what they've always felt,
right,
they're going to say no. Right?
Yes.
It's like if it's like when people take medication for the first time, lots of times they're like, I feel really sluggish. I feel like a robot. And it's like, well, no, you just feel like the rest of people who aren't at a 10 at all times.
Yes.
And you got to slow down and get used to being slowed down. But you sometimes that anxiety is that positive coping where it's like, or negative coping where it's like, well, I know what this feels like. And so I'm in control of this, but slowing down, now I'm like, I can't even get anxious, and that weirds me out.
Being more comfortable in chaos.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And I think too, when we talk about anxiety, there's 2 components. There's the thought process and the cognitive piece of anxiety, and then there's the physiological response. There's the nervous system. And so important in both kids and adults is that our thought process, our cognitive thinking is worst case scenario, planning the worst things that could happen, and analyzing things, and that level of work that we do with anxiety. But then there's also the nervous system, the sweating hands, the heart beating fast, the knots in your stomach. And I think it's important to acknowledge, especially with kids, that when you are alerted to potential risk or discomfort, your body goes into fight, flight, or freeze. And when your body's ready to fight or flight or even freeze, it tenses up. So even your stomach, which is a muscle, contracts. And so that's why you may feel sick to your stomach when you get anxious, because your body is responding in a physiological way to thoughts that you're having. So while we do the work to do the mental gymnastics of the cognitive piece to be able to control your body and your nervous system. It's kind of a two-part thing.
Yeah, they're connected. And I think, it's kind of a new thought. And what we're trying to open people's eyes to is to look at yourself holistically and see how your body is affected by your trauma, and your trauma affects your body. And I remember being a kid, and my grandmother was the head secretary at the elementary, and I would have to go home every day to use the bathroom, and then she would give me my Lana. So eventually I got an irritable bowel syndrome disorder diagnosis, and I was taking Prilosec and all this stuff. And now I look back, I'm like, I was anxious because my parents were divorcing, and when I was 8. Right. But like no one ever named that. It was a physical issue. Right. That was going to be treated by my doctor and by medication, and now I'm like, well.
Yes, they're so intertwined.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that's why when people say they're having an anxiety attack, that they feel like they're having a heart attack, right? They go to the emergency room because it is so physical. And people say it's just in your head. Well, no, it's not. It's in your body as well. Mm-hmm. And it feels very real, and it starts in your head. But even when you get your mind and your thought under control, your body's still reacting. And so that's a separate piece to try to calm it down.
Yeah. So what are some, what does anxiety look like specifically in children? Like, so you mainly, you didn't mention the play therapy stuff, but.
Oh yeah. So I guess I do play therapy. I work with kids. I do trauma focused CBT, which is, I think 5 to 12 is what that specializes in. I work with adolescents. I do EMDR, CBT, things like that. So play therapy is one treatment option for kids, but what you ask, like, what it looks like in kids. I mean, so first of all, some part of anxiety is developmentally appropriate, right? Like separation anxiety from ages 6 months to 9 is what we consider developmentally appropriate. The fact that kids are separating from a loving and attuned caregiver is important in their development. They're, developing object permanence, so that when something they don't see it still exists. And so they experience this anxiety. And so that's what it looks like at the beginning of life from 6 to 9 months. But what it looks like in kids as they get older, the typical things like fingernail biting, lip biting, shyness can be an example of anxiety, avoidant behaviors, refusing to do things, but it also can look like aggression and irritability, sleeplessness, hypervigilance. And so what's hard to answer about that question is it's unique to each child, right? We have to know our own kids, and we can tell when they're getting anxious and how they respond differently than they normally would if they weren't feeling that vigilant.
Yeah, and so how much of that is the choice? So like, a lot of times I see parents who are like, well, just stop doing that, essentially.
Sure.
So how much of that is a 0 to 5-year-old, 0 to 7-year-old, even 8, 9, 10-year-old's choice?
I would say it's a response. And so we can choose our response in some way, but it's meeting some kind of need. So saying don't do that isn't fixing the problem, right? It's just wanting them to do it in a different way. And so saying stop biting your lip, stop picking at your lip, that doesn't fix what they're nervous about. It's just the way they've chosen to cope with it. And picking at your lip doesn't always have to be anxiety too. It can be a sensory input. It can be, so it's hard to differentiate. And so you have to kind of know your kid and know how they respond to things. So I'd say it's not a choice in that way.
Yeah, it's good. Yeah, what should a parent say when they see their kid doing something anxious, like biting their nails, picking their lip, besides stop doing that? Right.
So besides stop doing it, what isn't super helpful, it's trying to get to the root of what they're feeling. So you might point it out, like I notice you're picking your lip. Is there something that's bothering you? What are you feeling in your body? I think one of the practices as parents we should get in the habit of doing is what's called body scans, right? So like at night, if we just say, where do you feel the stress in your body? There's different techniques. There's progressive relaxation, there's guided imagery and things like that. But body scans for even just a toddler, tell me where you're feeling your stress. Yeah. Because the more they can connect that they're using their finger to pick at their lip, makes them feel more calm in some way. That's a control thing, right? To be able to do a certain behavior over and over again to feel a sense of control. The faster we can help them label that, the more empowered they feel to kind of overcome that behavior, I would say.
Right. So it starts with, for those of us with little bitty kids like me and you, it starts with teaching those habits and developing those neuropathways and those things early on.
Right.
That letting them learn about their emotions, letting them learn about what they feel, then being able to express what they can do, giving them resources to find what fits their body, what fits their personality, so that we can figure it out with them.
Right.
Instead of just giving them a treatment to fit a behavior, we're trying to say, who is this kid? And how can we resource them so they can be responsible for their own de-escalation eventually?
Right. Yes, that's the goal, to equip them, point those things out, not in a shaming way, right? Because if you shame them out of a behavior, it just feels like I can't feel this way. Instead of you do feel this way, what do we do about it?
Right.
With that support. But how anxiety looks different in kids, what I see in my office is that, kids don't have a fully developed prefrontal cortex. And so as adults, we have irrational thinking all the time, but we can balance it with adaptive thoughts, with thoughts that are true. And we have the capacity to do that with fully developed brains. But kids, they don't yet have that capacity to the fullest. So if they're thinking irrationally, they can't just access their prefrontal cortex and decide that that's not logical, that doesn't make sense. And they're just...
Well, if they're 0 to 4, they don't even really have a left brain.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. And so our expectation that they would just think logically about something is not realistic.
That's crazy. I'm like, why would you do that? And as I hear it coming out of my mouth, I'm like, oh, because your brain is like,
yes,
not there.
Yes, because you don't know what you're doing. They don't know what they're doing. And to shame it's not going to be helpful.
Although we want to say those things.
Of course we do. Yes, because why would you do that, right? Like, that doesn't make any sense to our adult brains. But to their brains, they're just experimenting with what's going to happen. And it's a level of cause and effect that bridges that gap between emotional and logical. And that's kind of their job, to figure that out at that age.
Yeah, I think a lot of that increase in anxiety for kids, too, is we have a lot more anxious parenting. There's a lot of fear that's come over us in the last 10 years, 20 years. For a long time, I think parents just didn't even pay attention to their kids. There was just, not that they didn't love them, they didn't care about them, but they were too busy trying to survive and make an income and keep the house together. And then we got into kind of entertainment and culture, and especially in America, we've become more luxurious in the things that we can do and the time that we have to just chill out and relax. And that's actually created more anxiety because now there's more things to fear, more things to focus on for adults. And then, so how does an adult anxiety, so like, let's say an anxious parent, how does that affect the child?
Well, back to what you're saying about society, and now that we have social media and mass communications, we know every bad thing that's ever happened to every kid everywhere, right? All the time. And so as parents, we no longer have to imagine the horrible things that can happen to kids. It's just blasted all over our news feeds or whatever it is. And so I think more than ever, we have access to the things that are statistically very unlikely to happen, but because we see pictures and we feel connected, it feels more likely. And so I think that does feed our anxiety as parents. But how it impacts our parenting is, as anxious parents, we raise anxious kids. Because we say, don't touch that, don't do that, you'll fall over, you'll get hurt. And that teaches them that nothing is safe. And so it feeds and it develops those neural pathways that I need to be cautious at all times. And then when they grow up to be cautious, we feel confused, even though we've been encouraging them to be cautious as kids, their whole life.
Yeah, so what's the balance? Like, because what I know of you is that you're not saying don't tell your kids something's unsafe, but how do you balance that? So, like, are there healthy risks that kids should be taking that we should be allowing?
Sure. And it doesn't mean, I think, monitoring and intervening when necessary, but not alerting them to every scared thought that you have, right? Like, we could watch them and say, this could happen, this could happen, this could happen. Like if they're jumping over rocks in a river, instead of saying, be careful, you might fall in, like, obviously that's a potential, but saying, do you notice that rock? Do you notice the river? Like, what are you thinking about this? And help them gauge their own ability to be cautious and not just instill your catastrophic thinking into their brain.
Especially if it's a level where they're not going to die, or they're not going to get really maimed or injured. So if they're just, wanting to walk on a plank, or like my kids love to climb up on the swing set, it's like, well, they've done it 100 times. What cues me into this as I'm thinking about it? So Jude, my 3.5-year-old, like climbs this whirly thing at the school, I would never let him do that if it was on my terms. But then I get there and I see him doing it, and he's never hurt himself, and I didn't even know he was capable of it. But like seeing him up there, I'm terrified, and they're like, "Oh, he does that every day." You know what I mean? But it's like that's our own anxiety and our own protection, and sometimes we can hold them back because we're too worried about it ending in catastrophe.
Right.
When the likelihood is they can easily climb that thing and it's fine.
And I would say, if you're going to say, be careful up there, but it's not actually going to change, if they're unsafe enough where you have to say, get down from there, you're not doing that, then that's worth intervening about. Mm-hmm. But if you're just sharing your anxiety about the situation, be careful. That doesn't actually make them more careful typically. Mm-hmm. That's just you expressing your own feelings about the situation.
Yep.
So I have to double check my own thoughts when I say, is this my own anxiety or is what I'm sharing actually helpful to help them navigate a potentially dangerous situation, which obviously we want to avoid.
Right. And you can say, if you need my help, let me know.
Yep.
I mean, there's other things you can do besides be careful. That's dangerous. Watch that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Helping them notice on their own instead of pointing those things out to them can be helpful.
What else? So that's directly at the child, but like, what are some other things that I think maybe anxious parents pull over on, to pass on to anxious kids?
I think our need for reassurance, right? I think when kids ask, what if this happens? Sometimes we entertain that. And when kids ask, what if, what they want is certainty, right? They want a certain answer. And we actually cannot provide that in most cases. And so...
Like, what if you die?
Right.
That's what Grady's asking me all the time. Well, if you die, who am I going to live with? I think he's been doing that a bunch lately.
Yes. And so, as a parent, it's our natural tendency to want to...
That's not going to happen.
Right. to dismiss what a reality could be and to dismiss the anxiety because we don't want them to feel uncomfortable or suffer or
That's so good.
Or feel any sort of discomfort at all. And so if that thought brings him discomfort, then we need to erase that thought from your mind, right? We need to not acknowledge that or see it as a potential outcome. And that doesn't set kids up well to handle stress in the future.
Well, it builds no resiliency either.
Right.
Because it's like, and I get it. I don't want my kids to suffer. I think that's something right now that I struggle with. It's like that instinct of make everything comfortable and everything fine and everything happy, and that'll mean a successful life.
Right.
I know with what we do that's not true, but I still feel it.
Yes. Well, nowadays they call that snow plowing. Snow plowing parenthood. It's different than helicoptering because we're just snow plowing any obstacle out of their way. And how do we build resiliency? Well, resiliency requires struggle. And how do we allow our kids to struggle and not feel horrible about that? Of course, we're not putting them in dangerous situations where they're going to have really hard lives. I had a client say, I had a really hard life and this kid has a really great life, but they're still anxious. So what do I do about that? I can't make them tough like I had to be, growing up. And so I think resiliency, when you don't fail, you don't learn how to bounce back from failure or from stress. And so how do we create opportunities in our home where they can fail, right? Like play your kids in board games and beat them, right? Like don't let them win every game.
Right. You mean they might throw a fit and you might have to teach them some emotional regulation and
right.
Or some responsibility and you can't throw all that at your sister?
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's why
But that takes time, Kelsey.
It does. It slows us down. This takes a lot of work. It slows us down, and to beat our kids at a game, like, oh, well, they're going to be sad about that.
They're going to think I don't love them.
But also the alternative is that we teach them that they can win every game, and that's not life.
And then when they do finally lose, what's going to happen?
Yes. And so I think when kids lack resiliency, they also lack self-esteem, right? So like what I see in my office is kids with low self-esteem is because they've never had to do anything on their own. And so when they do something the first time and fail, they feel like I can't do anything. And that's just not the case.
Yep. There's a lot of pressure on that one moment.
Yes.
Instead of slow incremental failures and successes and bouncing back and figuring out how to navigate your imperfections. And
right.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. I mean, you can let your kid fail a spelling test in elementary school because the consequences of that are not substantial, right? So if we can teach them to fail and bounce back, when they get to high school and they get to adulthood with things that And not that those things don't matter, because they matter very much to a kid, and you can validate that, but it doesn't feel as consequential from a parenting perspective of what's going to happen if they fail at a young age.
Yeah, and there goes the anxious parent, right? It's like, well, if you failed this one spelling test in 3rd grade, you're not going to get into Harvard.
Right.
Yeah.
But also it bounces back to why do we do this? Why do we snowplow for our kids? Well, because our perspective has shifted that our kids' behavior is a reflection of us. And that's not true. That's a new philosophy. That's a new way of saying things. And so if my kid fails, then I failed.
And new by you mean like 50 years.
Right.
Yeah.
Like the idea that parenting is that your kid's behavior is a reflection of how well you did at parenting. Kids are their own people.
Yeah.
And it's our job to steward them and, hone in on their skills. But also, if they fail, you're not a failure.
Nope.
If they mess up, you're not a failure. And if that's your mindset, that if my kid fails, then I'm a failure, then of course we're never going to let them fail. And that's problematic.
Yep. That's good. Yeah, I said the other day to somebody, I said, we were talking about this and they were debating, and I said, well, Adam and Eve had perfect parents. And they still chose sin and brokenness and failure.
Yep.
And that's not a reflective of an imperfect God. So even if you are a perfect parent, like I tell myself that all the time, even if I do all the therapeutic things,
Right.
Grady and Jude are going to have to work out their own stuff. Your kids are going to have to work out their own stuff. And
Yep.
man, that's a relief for me.
Right.
I mean, it holds myself to a standard, but at the same time, like, it helps me to realize that I don't have to have this crazy expectation.
Right.
Because then that's inauthentic.
Yep.
Right. And so when we're parenting from an inauthentic way, we're not being true. And our kids know that too, which actually then leads to anxiety. Because if I'm always walking around like this perfect Christian dad who does everything perfectly right, and I'm always right and never wrong, and you just need to listen to me, that's something that they feel like they need to measure up to.
Mm-hmm.
And they know they can't. So then every failure is something that separates them from me, that breaks down our attachment. And if I'm supposed to be their primary attachment figure, who they feel safe with, who they can bring failures to, and it's enough, and they're worthy and they're safe, then if they can't do that, it's a huge mess.
Right.
And I see so much of that in our culture.
Yeah. The Harvard Institute of Child Development did a study that shows that the number one factor in building resiliency in your kids is relationship, which is not surprising to us, right?
Right.
But as a society, it's not. If you work harder, if you criticize harder, if you control more, it's that they're connected and they feel safe to fail. And that's how you build resiliency, is failure, but you also have that unconditional love from a attuned caregiver.
Yeah, there's a really good book, The Coddling of the American Mind. I can't think of the Jonathan Haidt. I think he's Canadian, but maybe not. Anyway, he's a social psychologist, and he's Jewish. And it's the research in the book is so good. He has another one, The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Argue About Religion and Politics. And I love it because he's not a Christian, but so much. I mean, he's Jewish, so he believes in some of the similar things we do. But he dives into the science of it and just kind of parallels the same thing. And one of the things he talks about is that the 24-hour news cycle is what really amped up our anxiety, is that, John Benet Ramsey, these early kids got, taken, or there was a murder, and we all started panicking. We're like, our kid can't go down the aisle at Target, can't go to the store. Well, at the same time, it was coming out of a culture who never supervised their kids, and there were all these terrible things happening that no one ever found out about until they're in our offices and they're 45 and 50, and they're like, oh yeah, I was sexually abused, or I was harmed, or I was this.
Yeah.
And I think we're in the middle in 2021 of like this merging of those two worlds.
Right.
And then you insert technology, and it's made it quite the mess.
Right. I think what goes hand in hand in the anxiety, the increased anxiety I see in my office is this increased idea of perfectionism. And I heard recently something that stuck out to me, the idea that perfectionism does not make you perfect. It makes you feel constantly inadequate. And I was like, gosh, that's it, right? Because perfectionism, while it's our desire to do everything right all the time, doesn't actually achieve that. It just makes you feel it just makes you feel inadequate.
Because you can't.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
You're not perfect.
Right. And so noticing how critical we are with our own kids, I mean, I would encourage you, if you have kids, to notice how many times you say, don't do that, don't do it this way. And not even for safety reasons, just because it's not your preference or how you would do it. And the language that we use, I mean, in my mind, I filter it through. If it's not unsafe and it's not unkind, if I just think it's annoying or not my preference or not how I would do it, I try to let it go, right? If it's just not how I think it should be.
Yeah. Can you say those 3 things again?
If it's not unsafe, if it's not unkind,
and it's just not your preference.
If it's not my preference, then just they can choose how to do it. Because I think that constant criticism and control and pushing our preferences on how we think kids should do things creates low self-esteem. And I think that leads to anxiety as well. So
yeah, definitely. I fight, I don't know about you, but I fight this battle, and I know yours are younger than mine, so they're not quite as opinionated yet, but I fight this battle with Grady of like, I've built in him this ability to ask questions and have his own personal desires. And sometimes it's like, I don't want you to have those.
Right.
I just want you to do whatever I'm telling you without thinking.
Yes.
You know, and sometimes I need him to, but that's very rare.
Yes.
When I stop and do what you just did, it's like, oh yeah, I don't actually need you to do this right now in this way.
Right. Like the amount of times I get asked to bring a random object into the car, it's like, can I bring this with me? It's like, why? Like, why would you need whatever it is? The beach ball, that was what was recently in the back of my car. You know, I want to bring this with me in the car. Okay. It's not unsafe. It's not unkind. Then sure, you can choose to bring this. It's not a battle worth fighting. Because we could fight battles all day long about how we think things should be done. We just have to kind of choose those battles. And that's how I kind of help filter what battles I'm going to choose.
Yep.
So
that's good. So what is typical versus problematic anxiety? And so, you know, all of us get anxious about whatever. Like we both probably get a little anxious before we do the podcast. I get anxious before I speak, about 5 minutes before I'll get really nervous. But that doesn't become problematic for me. You get over it and you kind of push through it. That you have that resiliency. So how would somebody know if this is like just normal anxiety, or is there normal anxiety? And then what's problematic?
Sure. So I think what becomes problematic is when our reaction to something that makes us anxious is disproportionate, right? It's too large. It's reoccurrent over a long period of time. Like if you're going to start a new job or a first day of school, like of course kids are going to be anxious. Things are new. The risk or discomfort is they don't know anyone. They feel awkward, and they can be resilient and kind of get through that. But if we would say when I worked at a school, if it was more than 3 or 4 weeks that they're refusing to come into school, like that becomes problematic, because then it's affecting their daily functioning and it's inhibiting them from going to school and learning and doing the things they need to be doing. So I would say if something persists over a long period of time, I think the DSM-5 says 6 months, but really it's whatever you're comfortable with dealing with, whatever's stopping you from living your life. Like I say, if they're afraid of thunderstorms, it's okay to be scared while a thunderstorm is occurring. If they're looking up the weather every day and they don't want to go outside because there's a 10% chance of thunderstorms, like when it starts to impact them not wanting to leave the house, them checking something every day, that starts to fall into the category of problematic, because there's not a current threat. It's the anticipation of the potential of a very unlikely event, and that's what kind of categorizes as problematic anxiety.
Yeah, we talked about this the other day about how many kids are scared of like thunder and you know, so again, what's not helpful is to say don't be scared.
Sure.
Right? So what is helpful?
Well, if they're asking questions like what if a tree falls on my house? What if a tornado comes through? The most helpful thing is to say, what do you think about that? Right? Because again, when they're asking you a what if question, they're wanting some sort of certainty, and we don't have that. We can't guarantee a tree's not going to fall in the house. Is it likely? Probably not. But when we put the question back on them, we're no longer fueling this need for reassurance. We're creating the ability for them to challenge their own thinking and also give them the tools to cope with the fear that is appropriate during a storm, but not create the reassurance that we provide to be dependent on what we say.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about appropriate fear. So what's normal anxiety? So, or because I think, especially as Christians, I think people are like, oh, you shouldn't fear. You know, so I always say, we said this the other day, but it's like if you're in the woods and you're hiking with your family and there's a grizzly bear, or you see a cub come out of the trail, like you better be afraid, right? Like it lets you know, like you said in the very beginning, it's a feeling that cues you into there's going to be a problem. I'm anticipating a problem, and I need to do something about that.
Yep.
So why isn't that a problem, and how do we relate that to don't be afraid?
Well, I think, I guess God created us with this system, this alarm, this amygdala in our brain that fires when there's risk. And so if you see a bear and they're coming out, we need to do something. We need to fight, flight, or freeze to survive, right? And so the idea of anxiety, it protects us. It serves a purpose. It's not all negative. It's there to keep us safe. It's there to try to protect us. It's when it controls us that it becomes problematic. And so in the moment, to have a feeling of fear, I don't think is what we need to avoid. I think it's the anticipation that every time I go into a woods, there's going to be a bear that comes out.
Oh, that's good.
Because that's very unlikely.
Right.
But in our mind, if we're preparing for worst case scenario, I mean, you could think of every vicious animal that's in the forest all the time, but is that going to ruin your walk in the woods? Probably.
Yeah. It has mine before.
Yes.
The first time I took my kids for a walk, I was like, I never had ever thought about any danger in the woods. And then I was just like, are there wolves in Louisiana? Like I went down this whole thing, like, what dumb thing did I just do?
Yep.
And that, I think, as a parent, again, we have to self-regulate and not just like, all right, let's get out of here. There's bears.
Yep.
Yeah, there are bears, but it's very unlikely that a bear would come and attack us randomly in the woods.
Yes. And also, I think us preparing for that is an illusion of control, right? Because if you in your mind have prepared for the bear to come to attack you, you think you know what you're going to do, and you are prepared in your mind, and that gives you some sort of control over the situation. That some situations we just don't have control over.
Oh man, that spreads out to so many things in our culture right now.
Yes.
Yeah. We always talk about, as military guys and some guys that I talked to, we were talking about concealed carry. And again, I don't have a stance on guns or whatever, but what people, if they've never been in the military and they shoot at a target and they practice, and they're like, oh yeah, I carry my gun so that if the shooting happens in the school or the shooting happens in the theater, I'll be prepared. And it's like, you don't know what would happen or what you would be capable of unless you've been in that situation. And there's a Navy SEAL quote that says, most people don't, when the stuff hits the fan, most people don't know where the fan is. And I love that he doesn't say stuff. But the point is, for all of us, is we can be prepared as much as possible. But yeah, unless you're in the moment, unless your kid comes with this crisis, unless they're hurt and they break their leg, unless you don't know what you're going to do.
Right.
And so it actually is freeing to go, I'll do the best I can, but I'm not going to know exactly what to do.
Yep.
And be able to predict it.
Right. And you can only handle what comes when it comes, right? Like you have to just be flexible and open-minded in that way and not desire that kind of control to be able to predict things. Again, that's the addiction to predictability.
I love that. That's such a good quote.
That.
Yeah. We need to make a shirt. Addiction to prediction. Okay, so our goal is to not be anxious parents, which obviously means, and you can listen to all of our podcasts for this, but do your own work, figure out why you're anxious, get past the symptoms of the body and the emotions and the control or whatever coping mechanism you have to deal with your anxiety, and get to your own root causes.
Yep.
So that you can start to see what you're projecting onto your kids.
Yep.
So if you do that work and you figure that out, what are some ways that we can teach kids kind of healthy emotional regulation?
Sure. So I talk about when we have kids, what we need to teach them is they need to know the language for feelings, right? They need to know the words: happy, sad, scared, but there's so many, right? Disappointed. And I have, my 3-year-old will tell me, I feel disappointed, right? I wanted something to go one way, it went another way, and so you're disappointed. And there's something about labeling that gives us a sense of familiarity. Like I've dealt with this before, because feelings for kids are just whole body sensations. I mean, for adults, they're like that too. But that's why they look like a fish out of water when they're having a tantrum on the floor, is because it's a whole body experience, head to toe, the whole feeling, right? And they're big and they're loud. And that's because their nervous system, it's figuring it out. It's when they're angry, their whole body is angry, right? They can't hide that. I think as adults, we learn to hide that. We learn to mask that. for social reasons, for social consequences. But kids, they haven't quite learned that yet. And so we get to see it. And so that is an opportunity to be able to point out, hey, I see you doing this. It means you're feeling this way. And so I had a parent ask me, how often are you doing that? I'm like, probably like 30 times a day, right? I'm saying, you look mad, you look sad, you look happy, you look excited, you look proud of yourself. Oh, your body's feeling hyper. Oh, your body's feeling overwhelmed. Giving them the language to connect the dots between what their body is experiencing and what's going on can give them a sense of empowerment, really. So the language of feelings is really important. And then being able to identify their own feelings so they can connect the dots. And then part of that comes with being able to identify the feelings of other people, right? Look at other kids and see, oh, they're crying, they're screaming, they must be feeling that way. And then to be able to accept that feeling and validate it and just accept it in their own body and not fight it. And then to communicate it to us. And then after they communicate, we can support with the next step, which would be coping. But for us to think we're going to skip from feeling to coping is just unrealistic. Because their limbic system on their brain is on fire, and they're not even able to reach the front of their brain where they would make any logical decisions. And so we have to calm them down before they can think clearly about anything. Yeah. And so it should never be to teach them in those moments not to do that or why we shouldn't do that, because if they're worked up about something, they're not even hearing you.
Yeah, it's so true. Yeah, and I think that, and we know this as far as trauma responsive care, it's like that's really how all adults are too.
Yeah.
No one who's worked up and emotional at past a level is listening or to learn.
Right.
Their left brain's turned off and their right brain's on.
Yeah.
And yet we just try to teach and be logical in these moments of emotional things because we don't want them to do it again.
Yep.
I think that's the other insane thing, is that we think we're going to create these little robots who just never have any bad behaviors. And, it's like, this is inconvenient. I really don't want to deal with this right now. So let me teach you how not to do this so I never have to deal with this again.
Right.
And it's like, oh, that's not
And
helpful.
their behavior is reflective of them being a kid. Right? It's not reflective of you. It's not reflective of the decision. It's just, that's what kids do. They're figuring out how they feel about things. And so, to expect them to be able to cope right away, we have to be able to teach them how to calm down so they can think straight. We can't go straight towards thinking straight.
Yeah, and if we miss that step, then we create really anxious adults who don't know how to regulate.
Yes.
You saw it, but I posted this thing about we're using this generational mindful corner, and we're working on that with Jude and Grady, and I had so many people say, "Oh man, I need that closet too." Yes. People messaging me, PM me at different things and asking me questions or what books or whatever, and so many people are like, "I don't know how to do that." Like I have no clue how to to say what I feel, give myself a task to do. De-escalate, and then talk about what I want to do differently and how I feel now.
Right. Which how on earth can we expect that of our kids then?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing about it. And I recognize that in myself, that it's a constant battle to be regulated because we cannot regulate kids as unregulated adults.
Nope.
And so the first step is recognizing your own stuff and being able to calm down. I mean, I have to walk away from situations more than once a day where if I know what I'm going to do is not helpful, I just have to walk away and come back to it.
Yeah.
Because what I want to teach is it requires modeling it. If I can't just say, be calm, right? Like that's not going to work. Because I'm saying it, first of all, in the most uncalm tone. But we don't jump from, oh, okay, now I'm calm now. Thanks, Mom. That was helpful. I wish.
I wish it would. Some days. Like, we have to get out of this house if you don't calm down.
Yes. And so to be able to model, like, Mom's a little worried about this, Mom's a little stressed about this, and this is what I'm going to do about it. Right? I'm not saying share your emotions with your kids and make it their problem, right? Because it's your job to deal with your own emotions. I think when you just tell your kid you're stressed because you want them to make you feel better, like, that's inappropriate and not helpful. But to say, like, I'm stressed about this, and so I'm going to turn on some music. I'm going to drink a glass of ice water. I'm going to go step outside. I'm going to go take a break. I mean, we have to verbalize that if we want our kids to to grasp, because sometimes when we say, I just want to pretend I'm not anxious all the time, first of all, the message that sends is that don't be anxious, which is unrealistic. But it also sends the message that it's not okay to be anxious, which is also problematic. So to be able to share in appropriate increments with kids how you're feeling and how you're going to handle it, but that requires you knowing how you feel and how you're going to handle it, which may be the first step if you're wondering what to do next with your kids.
Mm-hmm. That's good. Yeah, because if you can't emotionally regulate yourself, if you don't know why you feel what you feel, then you can't communicate to them any healthy ways of coping. And so typically what I see is people just avoiding it altogether,
Yeah.
And then that gets into the behavior modification, which then teaches them that their worth and value is in how they perform and how they, please you. And then that actually breeds way more anxiety than just dealing with the problem.
Right.
That's good. All right. So that's how to teach them emotional regulation. So there's all that. And you covered a little bit about perfectionism, being problematic, but anything you want to touch on with that?
I don't think so. I think we covered just the idea that our criticism is going to breed perfectionism, and that breeds low self-esteem, and that causes anxiety. So to check our own criticism, I think, is the message there.
Yeah. So mindfulness. So we talked about that a little bit. One of the things that I think about is with Scripture, it always talks about wisdom, and I relate wisdom to insight, which then I relate to mindfulness. So follow me for a second. So wisdom in Scripture is about being wise, being able to look into yourself, being able to know who God is, know who you are, know who other people are. And then for us, we would call that insight, like being able to stop and go, what do I feel right now and why? And so when I think of mindfulness, I think of that's what being mindful is like being able to take all that in and pause and just kind of like pay attention to what I'm doing.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
So why is that, well, number one, we have to know how to do that, but why is that so important for children to learn to be mindful of their selves, of their surroundings?
Well, I think it switches us from having our emotions control us to us being in control of our emotions. I think mindfulness is the switch there. I think we want to move from being reactive to responsive, and there has to be like a breath there. There has to be a space, because reaction is quick, right? It's what's our first instinct, which is often not helpful. And so...
Absolutely.
Yes. And so what...
Or at least mine are.
I mean, all of us, all humans, it's what we want to do in a reactive state is not often the most helpful thing. So mindfulness is a breath. It's figuring out what's going on in your own brain and your own body, and that sensation or that does give us a sense of control. And especially when you're anxious, when you feel out of control or helpless, being mindful helps combat some of those ideas, because it puts you back in the driver's seat of your own emotions, and they aren't just happening to you. They're happening in your own body, and you get to decide how you respond to things in that moment.
So what are some ways people can either be mindful themselves or teach their kids to be mindful?
So I think it takes the work of identifying your own beliefs, your own belief system. I think, again, being familiar with your own body and what it does. And like, as I'm getting ready for the podcast yesterday, I'm like kind of tossing and turning last night, couldn't fall asleep. I wasn't necessarily thinking about the podcast per se, but in my body somewhere, there's a stress of, I have to go and record this thing, and I'm nervous about it. And, I have to know my own beliefs. So what's the risk or discomfort of me going on a podcast? Well, I would say something dumb, and that would mean that I'm dumb, right? If I said something dumb, said something I didn't mean, or said something wrong, that would mean that I'm not good enough at my job, not good enough to communicate what I know, or that I don't know enough. And I can combat that negative belief that I'm not good enough with adaptive information, right? I know that because if I say something I don't mean on a podcast, or if I don't communicate exactly what I want to communicate, that doesn't make me a bad therapist. It doesn't make me a bad person. And so it challenges some of those beliefs that, if you're feeling anxious about something, it's probably fueling this fear that I would be not good enough, right? That would be mine in this situation. This fear that I'm not good enough. And really, when I get to the end of this, like, that doesn't get to determine if I'm good enough, but that's after counseling, right? That's after doing my own work. That's after recognizing those beliefs and having enough thoughts in my head to be able to combat that with truth. And so...
And it's not that you don't have that struggle.
Right.
It's that you have tools and you're aware of what that struggle is for you.
Yep. And it makes it faster.
Absolutely faster.
The more you process it, the more you practice. Okay, I'm feeling restless. I'm feeling like I can't sleep. Well, that means I'm anxious. And what am I anxious about? This podcast, and that, if I mess up, I'm not good enough. Well, is that true? No. Okay, then go to bed. Right? So the more you do that, the faster you get. And it makes the risk of the situation dissipate, because the risk is no longer that you would be not good enough.
Mm-hmm.
It just means you make a mistake, which is no big deal.
Right.
In the scheme of things.
So that's inside you, and that's internal. What are some external things, so I'm thinking relationally, that also help to speak that truth into your life?
Right, like friends, friendships, people. Before we go, you don't care what I say, right? Just tell people that you know what you're talking about. And so I think our community, the people we surround ourselves with, scripture, I think speaks truth into our lives, like in a lot of ways that we can, just get people around us who I have friends who, if they listen to this podcast, they're going to think it's the greatest thing they've ever heard, because they know me, and they don't care what I say.
And they love you, yeah.
Yes. And it could go horribly wrong, because that's a potential outcome, and they would still love me.
Right.
And so I have friends that speak truth and speak encouragement, and I think that externally kind of combats some of those thoughts too. Right.
So you said scripture. So one of the things I find helpful for kids, even starting to contextualize for parents, is to, if they're having a feeling or a negative belief, right? So our negative beliefs shape our thoughts and feelings, which shape our actions. So I think, anxiety is an action. It's a symptom of those thoughts and feelings, and then a belief. It's like, then we need to find some truth, right, in the Word, and kind of meditate on that and read on that and be mindful of that. And I think our kids can start doing that early on.
Yes. I think when we talk about scripture, I know we kind of discussed this too, scripture says, do not fear. Mm-hmm. It says that over and over and over again. And what does that mean? Mm-hmm. I think, it tells us not to fear because God wants something better for us than fear. But how do we combat that? How do we deal with that? Well, it's not to pretend like worry doesn't exist. Because, of course, there's a level of worry that exists in the world, especially as a parent. It calls us to overcome anxiety, which I think we do by acknowledging it exists and going through it. I think to be able to rest in the arm of Jesus with our anxiety and bring it to him, and not just avoid it and pretend like we're not, put up these walls. And if you don't face anxiety head on, it comes out sideways, especially in parenting. So to deal with it head on. But there's a level of anxiety associated with raising kids, and there's a alarm in our brain that alerts us to things to keep them safe. But God's telling us there's nothing wrong. God's not telling us there's nothing wrong, right? He's not telling us there's nothing wrong. He's telling us everything could go wrong, but I'm still here, and I'm still good, and I've got you. And so we can acknowledge that everything could go wrong, but he's saying, I still have you, and I'm still good, and you can trust me, and you can give your worries to me. I don't think when Jesus was weeping over Lazarus, it would have been really helpful for someone to knock on the door and be like, knock, knock. I see you crying. If I was reading scripture, and it talks about fruits of the Spirit, and actually tells us we should be joyful. And so if you could just wrap it up, right, and be joyful, that would make all of us much more comfortable.
That's so good, Kelsey.
But that's not what it is, because without grief, we don't know joy. Right? I mean, that's, I think, what Jesus was teaching us in that moment. And without worry, we don't know peace. And if you don't acknowledge the worry that you have and go through it instead of just pretending you don't have it, you won't know peace, which is the goal, right? That's what I think he's calling us to when he says, don't be afraid, is because he wants us to feel his peace. But to just pretend it doesn't exist isn't going to get you there.
No, that's so good. Yeah, avoidance is a huge process when dealing with trauma and dealing with our mental health, and we don't want to be uncomfortable. And I think that's gotten way worse with the American, like we said earlier,
yes,
with American life of everything is about comfort seeking. Everything is about immediate gratification.
Yep.
Everything is about that dopamine drip of, I feel bad, I feel anxious, I feel, so I'm just going to escape by making myself feel better with these trivial, instant gratification things.
Right.
And I think the whole ultimate goal of Christian life is deferring our reward.
Mm-hmm.
Is saying, I'm probably not going to be able to get the most pleasure right now. I'm probably going to have to deal with some pain and some uncomfortableness. And Scripture even says that in Romans, it's talking about the whole earth is groaning and moaning for Christ's return. It's like, but we don't have any room as Christians to groan and moan a little bit.
Yeah.
Like you can't grieve that your dad has cancer. You can't grieve that someone dies. You can't grieve that you were abused as a child. You can't grieve because God's good. And so we're supposed to just not fear and not be in pain and be at perfect peace. And I'm with you. That's not what Jesus was talking about.
Yeah. And I do think moving to the South down here, it's been an interesting.
Yeah, tell me about that.
To the experience of what it means to fear God. And parents have this belief that I need my kids to fear me.
Mm-hmm.
And man, I just think we miss it there, because I think when we talk about fearing God in the Old Testament, I think what that means is to recognize his power, right? To recognize that he's powerful, he's strong, he is perfect. And so we should fear him because he's powerful. But we miss the second hand of the story when he sent Jesus to be with us, and that connection is what's important.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I think that's what he did. He came down here for connection and to be among us and to be empathetic. And of course, he's powerful and worthy of being feared. But when we feel connected to him, we feel safe.
That's so good.
And so I think the goal of parenting, if you want your kids to fear you, to know you're in charge, to know you're powerful or whatever you're after, but you aren't humbling yourself like Christ did, to connect with them, to empathize with them. And that looks like apologizing when you're wrong, right? To go back and make amends, to getting on their level, to being on the ground, empathizing with the things that they really care about. If we're not humbling ourselves to that level, then we miss half the picture. You could aim for kids to just fear you.
A lot of people do.
I know. Just do what I say.
Yeah, and I think, that's a perfect tie into what we talked about earlier, which was, if you're making parenting all about you, then of course you're trying to force them to fear you in that way.
Mm-hmm.
Because you don't make any space for them.
Yeah.
You don't make any space for them to grow and develop and to make mistakes. You don't make any space time-wise. Somebody else had messaged me about the closet, and they're like, when do you have time for that? I'm like, you have to make time for it. I don't never have time for it. My selfish brain's like, I do not have time for this nonsense.
But we don't have time for their fits either.
Right.
And so let's just utilize what we've got.
Mm-hmm.
When we talk about, one of the things at my house, it's putting on shoes, right? It would be so much easier if I could just put your shoes on every single time. But am I going to teach you to put your shoes on then? Well, no. But then what does that look like? Does that look like me just throwing her shoes and say, put them on? Because she's going to go straight to, I can't do it.
Mm-hmm.
I can't do it myself. I need help. And so what that transition looks like of not doing everything for them from the beginning is sitting down, coaching them through it. You've got it. What you do is you do this. You maybe model it. You maybe do one shoe and then say, you try the other. You've got this. And then praising the process and not just the outcome. Good try. You're proud of yourself, right? That language is something I've shifted to, is because I can say I'm proud of you. There's nothing negative about that. But what I really want is for you to be proud of yourself.
Yeah.
Right? Because I could create a dynamic where you want me to be proud of you all the time, which of course I am, and of course I'm going to say, but ultimately I want you to decide that you're proud of yourself. And so I like to point that out when I see it in my kids, like, oh, you're proud of yourself. You did that all on your own, and that's great. And I think that helping them and sitting with them and coaching them through verbally and giving them encouragement rather than just doing it themselves. But that takes twice as long. And that's on me, because if we need to be out the door in 5 minutes, I need to readjust my timeline of when I start getting them ready, because they have no concept of time of getting out the door. And if we're rushing around, that's probably my fault.
Yeah, it is our fault. It happens all the time. And I'm letting them play and letting them destroy the upstairs or wherever, and then I'm like, oh yeah, we have 5 minutes to be, wherever out the door.
Yep.
And then I'm mad that they can't get it together.
Right.
It's like, well, that's totally on old dad, you know. And then we have to take responsibility for that, you know. And there are times in life where that's just going to happen.
Right.
Something happens and you're like, we got to go. But again, I always say, do the right thing 7 out of 10 times. You know, maybe 8 out of 10 if you can push it. But, you know, you just be consistent enough to where those other moments of rupture are easy to repair and you bounce back. And your kid's not thinking, oh, dad's going to yell. Oh, how's this going to go? They know how it's going to go. And when it's not like, man, I yelled at Grady. This is probably, might have been 3 months ago. I don't think I've ever raised my voice. Like, I usually will get dad voice and I'll raise my voice if it's dangerous or it's like he's about to break Jude's neck on something or, you know, whatever. But I got really mad about something and I yelled. And he kind of looked at me and then he went to the bed, like our bedroom. And then he was like, you've never yelled. That was being a bully. That you've never yelled at me like that. And I just got pushed to my limit, you know, and I sat there and I wanted to deny it, you know, and I was just like, no, you're right. No matter what you did, I should not have yelled. We don't yell that, you know, but I did, and I'm sorry, you know. And he's like, it's okay, you know. But it was because it's not normal,
right?
That he was shocked by it, you know. But you get to this point where I'm like, I've done all the breathing, I've done all the thing, I've done all the mindful parenting, I've done it. You're still not listening, and so do you want me to spank you and yell at you? I'm not going to do that. It's you know, that's not something we do. But it's like, at the end of the day, I don't know what else to do with you. And then I have to go, well, why am I trying to do something with him?
Yeah.
You know, like, I just need to be with him in these emotions. But then that fear comes in of like, well, if you don't fix it and adjust it and force it and make him afraid of you, he's going to be a mass murderer at 18 or he's going to move out and, you know, smoke crack. Like, that's where we go.
Yeah.
You know, it's crazy.
Yeah. And so to acknowledge that our kids are tiny humans deserving of love and respect. They're their own people. They have their own passions, skills, gifts that are separate from yours. And to just foster that, but also know that they're going to trigger some of your own stuff. And the faster you can get at getting through that, you know, the more successful you're going to be at handling their big feelings. But it takes a lot of work. It's not easy.
It does.
Certainly do not do it perfectly.
So lastly, I don't do it perfectly either, by any means. You know, I do think the more knowledge you have and the more work you do, then you do limit your damage. And I think that's really important for people to understand that you can be better than you are, that you can learn and you can grow. And if you find yourself yelling all the time or checking out on your phone or, you know, controlling or micromanaging or being fear-based, that the first step is just stopping and acknowledging that that's true. Mm-hmm. And then instead of shaming yourself, figure out why that is that it happened. Mm-hmm. And then do some work around that. Because very quickly, 6 months, 3 months, you can change your behavior and change your whole household.
Yeah.
I mean, we've seen it and we see it all the time. You know, that parents have so much power and kids are so resilient that if you've gotten into bad habits, man, they'll forget about those bad habits. Just show some consistency for just a little while. I mean, they'll totally change their behavior and shift.
And when I talk about being triggered by your kid's behavior, right? If your kid spilled a glass of something and you become enraged, right? That is not a proportionate or reaction to a situation. And so you're being triggered by something, whether it feels like you feel helpless, you feel out of control, you feel there's something else that you feel that's deeper rooted than just that isolated incident. Mm-hmm. And so to be able to recognize in yourself, why is this so infuriating to me? Because it's likely not about your kid. It's likely more about yourself and how that feeling makes you feel, mm-hmm. and your desire for control and whatever it is. So, but our kids shouldn't have to deal with that, right? That's our own to deal with.
Yeah, and we see that a lot in marriage. You know, mm-hmm. there's conflict in the marriage, and then they bring that over into the kids, or the kids try to triangulate, and so one parent's trying to be the good guy, and the other one's being the bad guy, and we can do a whole podcast on that. But, mm-hmm. you know, that means that the parents, the adults in the situation, have no insight into their own self.
Yeah.
And they're not seeing the effects.
Yeah.
But my encouragement would be, you know, get in therapy. Work on your own stuff. I mean, obviously, get your kid in therapy if they need it. So what would therapy look like to help anxiety? What would be kind of a typical thing that you do with kids that are struggling with anxiety?
Yeah, so with kids, a lot of the time it looks like play therapy, especially, like you would sit with an adult and talk verbally about their fears, or, kids can utilize play or expressive modalities with art and sand tray and things like that to express what we can easily speak about. So sometimes it looks like play therapy. Sometimes it does look like cognitive behavioral therapy. Included in play therapy, kind of mixing those two together to challenge any distorted thinking, to really just understand their beliefs. And you can do that the more you get trained on observing kids play, to be able to point those things out. So when I meet with kids, I meet with parents first, because I want to know what I'm walking into, and then to meet with them to try to understand their anxiety and give them some coping skills. We'll often trace kids on this big paper that I have, this big butcher paper. We trace them, we help them draw what happens in their body when they feel overwhelmed, and just equip them to identify their triggers and develop coping skills that work for them, and then kind of looping parents in and helping them partner with using that at home. I typically meet with kids and then meet back with parents to see how I can support them, because really the work, I can be a support, but the work is being done at home too. So to make it, to include the parents is important as well. But yeah, I'd say if your kid is suffering with anxiety that's debilitating in some way, or stopping them from functioning or doing things that they that they want to do but are feeling scared about, then bringing someone in as an extra support is always helpful, I would say.
Yeah, definitely. I've seen a lot of people, reduce their anxiety and their fear symptoms when they feel, it's such a weird trick. It's like, oh, I'm going to do these unhealthy things to gain control, when I could do the actual thing that, gains control. I think it would be the same thing with medication. Medication's helpful, but it's still just treating the symptom most of the time.
Yeah.
And sometimes you need a little medication to help you get to the place where the therapy can work.
Right.
But if you're out there and you're listening, and there are people around you, and the first instinct is, well, we need to go to our pediatrician, and he's struggling with anxiety, so let's just get him on some medication.
Yeah, and I think that when I typically say to parents when they're considering both, that let's try counseling, let's try some things, because certainly there's a genetic component to anxiety, right? There's some of us are born with, I think brain scans are showing that the amygdala is often larger in people with diagnosed anxiety disorders, because it's just, that's just genetically how they're just predisposed. And
you're good enough, Kelsey.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Or even just like the neurotransmitters, like the GABA, just like it's very innate in our being, in our genetics. And so of course medication would be helpful with some of those things going on in the brain, but let's not chalk it up to that at the beginning, right? Let's work on some things that we can control in our behavior and coping skills, and allowing them to feel equipped, and of course considering that later on. So that's typically what I say to parents when they bring kids in.
That's good. Yeah, we don't need immediate fixes and immediate gratification.
Yeah.
You gotta take it a little slower and do it inside the the bounds of relationships, and understanding who this kid is and what's going on, and in the context. And
yeah, I would say some resources that are helpful for parents. There's lots of good books out there. There's, David and the Worry Beast is a good one. Don't Feed the Worry Bug. Ruby Finds a Worry is a good one. I think I Am Fine. We've talked about that one. A good grounding one. So
all of those books from I Am Fine. It's like I Am Fine. All those series is really good.
Very grounding.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I can't remember the rest of them, but it's like I Am Fine. I Am Good. It's like they have a bunch of other books.
Yeah, that's a good series. So those are some books for resources for parents. But yeah.
There was one thing I was going to say. As far as resources, we'll put them up on the link, and people can find them. But I think the Mindfulness app. What is that? Headspace. It's a really good one. And then if you have a teenager who's struggling with anxiety, I know I beat this dead horse a lot, but really look at how they're using their cell phone and how they're using social media, because I think that is killing us.
Right, the perfectionism part of that, the comparison game, I think it increases our anxiety, especially with teenagers. And I'd say what we experience as teenagers is completely different than what kids nowadays are dealing with as far as comparison in social media. And so getting the support from a therapist would be probably really helpful, because we can't relate. We did not have the same experience as adolescents to be constantly compared and judged based on things that we post and things like that. So
yeah, the unrealistic expectations are crazy. Well, this was super helpful. Anything you want to like cover, or that you feel like you didn't get to say that you'd like to say?
I think I always just like to say, if you find one or two things that you're going to do differently from a podcast like this is not to say you need to do a 180. You need to do everything differently, because those ideas, I think, make us feel like we're not good enough.
Uh-huh.
And we are good enough, because you've listened to a podcast on parenting kids with anxiety or anxiety, like you want to get better, and that's enough.
Mm-hmm.
But to pick out a few things you want to try is a good way to start. I think to think you have to change your entire approach, or that you've done it wrong into this point. Like, we only can do what we do until we know better, and then we go from there. And so it's not to bring any shame on how you've been doing things before, but just to encourage to try something different. So
yeah, I think that's super helpful. Shame reduction is something we're always trying to do as therapists, is help people reduce their own feelings of inadequacy and I'm not good enough and I'm terrible. And yeah, and sometimes it's hard to listen to podcasts. I mean, for me, it's the same way. It's like I read something or a new thing that I learned. I'm like, oh my God, I was reading something about the polyvagal theory this week, and it's a whole nother thing. But it's like, I didn't really know any. I mean, I knew somewhat about it. It makes sense in the context of all the trauma stuff I do know, but it's new. And then I'm like, oh, I need to read about this, and now I need to be an expert in. It's like, it's never. Cindy Willis and I always talk about that. It's like, there's all these certifications you want to get, and you can't have it all, and you can't know it all. And same thing as a parent. Like, you can only do the best you can in that moment. And so when we get overwhelmed with how much we have to do, sometimes we do nothing. And so I love that you just pick up one or two things and start with them, and then do it in community. Have other people go, hey, can I have some accountability with this? Husband, wife, can you, hold me accountable to this thing? And go from there.
Yep.
It's good. Thank you, Kelsey.
Thank you.
You did a great job.
I appreciate that.
You did. That was awesome. All right. If you need some resources, look us up, ClintDavisCounseling.com. You can find the podcast. You can look at our therapist. And then if you just need some help, reach out, shoot us an email, follow us on Facebook, Instagram. Please subscribe and, do all the things that you're supposed to do with podcasts. God bless you and have a good week.